Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Geller. I'm the Vice President for Student Development and one of the two co-chairs for the Intercultural Directions Council. First of all, I would like to recognize Brandon Woodard and his crew for everything they did to plan MLK Week. Is Brandon in the room somewhere? Could be he's running around taking. Brandon? Thank you very much for your leadership. Good afternoon. In the article referenced for today's session, the authors give 3 examples shedding light on the contemporary context for the urgent need to address diversity and inclusion in higher education. These 3 are growing political polarization, persistent racial division, and unrecognized intersectionality and privilege. The article states, the question should not be, how do we fix the problem of diversity? But rather, how can we use our diversity to find the unity from within? We must each examine this question on a personal and collective level. Diversity and inclusion are not problems to be solved, but personal and organizational opportunities to be leveraged in order to become a richer intellectual community. I've been doing some reading on MLK's beloved community. The core value of the quest for Dr. King's beloved community was agape love. Dr. King distinguished between 3 kinds of love, and I'm sure many of you have heard these in your courses. Eros, or romantic love, philia, affection between friends, and agape, the love of God operating in the human heart. Agape does not begin by discriminating between worthy and unworthy people. It begins by loving others for their own sake, and it makes no distinction between a friend and an enemy. Agape ultimately is love seeking to preserve and create community. This is akin to our Benedictine values that calls us to treat each person with infinite dignity and to welcome the stranger as Christ himself. The presidents are here today as leaders of these beloved and imperfect communities to continue this conversation. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to you today the presidents of St. John's and St. Ben's, Dr. Michael Hemesath and Dr. Mary Dana Hinton. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's delightful to see you all here. Welcome back. I think we're all feeling particularly Minnesotan today with the Vikings win and the ridiculously cold temperatures and winds outside, but it's good to have you back, and I appreciate you cheering over there for both of those. So welcome to our conversation about inclusion at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. As we think about what it means to be an inclusive community, I thought we could start with a broader conversation about higher ed in general. Then we'll talk about higher ed culture and move into some specifics about what we're doing at St. Ben's and St. John's, both thinking about what's been accomplished as well as what's on the horizon. We'll then have a little group conversation, and then President Hemesath will address you, and we will take questions at the end of that time together. So that's sort of our strategy for the next little while. In light of today being MLK Day, I thought that these would be fitting quotes with which to begin. And I will say that the first quote compels me because I think it's easy to distance oneself from issues of inclusion. You can say, well, I'm going to draw a line around what does and does not impact me directly. And yet, it has always been and will always remain so that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So whether you've done work around inclusion or given much thought to it or not isn't the issue today. It's the fact that if we are a community built on agape love, if something affects one of us directly, it affects all of us indirectly. And as such, I think all of us need to be concerned about issues of inclusion, even if we may not see its natural line in our own lives. So that's the first quote there from King. The second quote reflects the fact that the work we are about to undertake and have been undertaking at St. Ben's and St. John's as it relates to inclusion will be difficult work, It's demanding work, it's humbling work, and at times it's physically exhausting work. It's work and it's practices that we will have to think long and hard about as a community and as individuals in order to make our programming, our hopes, and really living into our mission manifest itself. So we have to think, and sometimes we have to think in difficult and challenging ways. So as I think about the difficulty of this work, I'm reminded of a Peter Drucker quote, that culture eats planning for breakfast. You see, over the past few years, I've become increasingly persuaded that one of the solutions to addressing inclusion on college campuses is actually not about finding the perfect program or programming. Students of color on our campuses today wrestle with the same challenges that I wrestled with when I was in college nearly 3 decades ago. I've questioned why some of the issues that we confront seem intractable. And I've come to believe that it's not about having a perfect plan, a perfect program, a perfect statement, or a perfect committee. Rather, I think it's about institutional culture. And while culture is comprised of all of the things that I've just named, it is mostly comprised of people. If we don't move the hearts, the skills, and the will of people, if we don't challenge and move the will of the community, then I don't think we will see change. And I think today's challenges will remain tomorrow and well into the future. So one issue that surfaced in the article that the IDC sent around and that came up in a book our cabinet read is around what do we need to take responsibility for when we think about inclusion on college campuses? What are we responsible for? Among the questions that I think all of us in this room need to wrestle with is what paradigms or practices or policies serve to marginalize our students, our faculty, our staff, and employees? What policies and practices are aligned with our campus's highest aspirations, vision, and mission for itself? What's excluded? What structures and strategies are in place to support organizational learning? So this question of how we better support current and future generations of students, and how do each of us in this room, whether we are faculty, staff, administrators, or students, how do we embrace responsibility for ensuring that every single student is successful at our institutions? So again, this takes me back to perhaps what we need to face is an issue of culture. And it leads to the question of how do we shift organizational culture on our campuses? So go with me as I make a little trip here to visit an iceberg, which honestly, if there was water at Renner House, you'd see one right on the front yard right now. So one of the ways that you can think about organizational culture, and I'm borrowing a little bit here from a researcher named Edgar Schein, is if you know anything about an iceberg, you know that they're huge. If you've ever had an opportunity to see one, they are massive. And yet what's so compelling about icebergs is that you only see 10 to 25% of the iceberg above the waterline. So they are huge and stabilized underwater. And I would argue that organizational culture is very much like an iceberg. What we see, what's on the surface, is the smallest part of our organizational culture. And in fact, I would argue that the 3 parts of culture that you hear researchers talk about, artifacts, values and beliefs, and underlying assumption, fit nicely on an iceberg. So those artifacts are the public statements that we make about who we are and what we value. It's the brochures and the public face that we want to share with the world. And that's the part of the iceberg that you can quite readily see. Our artifacts are what we are very comfortable with. So we function well at this level. We put out the right images, we put out the right programs. But if you go just a level below that, you'll tap into the values and beliefs of an institution, just below the waterline there. Values and beliefs are our mission commitments, our vision statements. They're the things that we say, that we hold dear, and the things that we talk about. Sometimes it's more difficult to see these, and they're more difficult to capture, but we have talking points for these. We know what to say. But just underneath our values and beliefs are our underlying assumptions, the things that we don't say, the hidden and the null curricula, if you will, on our campuses, the curricula that infuses our values and beliefs, that infuse our artifacts. And if these three components are not in alignment with each other, that's when we run into trouble. That's when people feel disenfranchised. And that's when we know that we're in a sort of a static state where very little will change. So what I hope you'll see as I go through some of what we'll be doing on campus in the next few days and reflect on next few months and reflect on what's been happening over the past few years, I think what you'll see is a movement from just conversation about artifacts and programming to really doing some of the work at the level of values and beliefs and our underlying assumptions and those invisible aspects of culture. Just one other piece before I talk about some of what we've been doing on campus. Part of the reason why it's so essential that we think about organizational culture is that we are a learning institution. For the students in this room, that will come as no surprise to hear me say that. You are learners, but I also think that institutions have an obligation to learn. And if you review Edgar Schein's work, you'll see that he writes quite often that, and I'm going to add organization in front of culture here, organizational culture is an accumulation of prior learning. What do we know from our institutions from St. John's beginning in 1857 through today, and St. Ben's emergence in 1913 through today? Our organizational culture is comprised of all of that prior learning. And we know that if we want to shift culture in some key areas, then that requires learning. So students, you can't be the only learners in the room. We all have to be learners together. We have to become a learning institution. And we need to get to the level of knowledge acquisition and insight to move to culture change, because that's what shapes our assumptions, our values and beliefs, and is made manifest in our artifacts. We have to create a learning organization to ensure a vibrant and dynamic culture and campus that serves all who are among us. AAC&U, that's the American Association of Colleges and Universities, have talked about this at length, and they're making excellence inclusive work. They have shared, and I certainly support their notion that in order to truly be excellent as institutions, and students, our excellence matters to you every day and will be particularly important as you graduate from our institutions. We become excellent when we not only ensure the best possible course of study, but when we ensure that all students are able to achieve at high levels academically and can contribute to learning and knowledge generation on our campuses, when we use our cultural difference to enhance our academic enterprise, and when we engage all of our diversity that each one of us as individuals brings in service of both student learning and, again, organizational learning. So with that backdrop from higher ed in general and a little bit about culture change, I want to share some information unique to St. Ben's and St. John's. So the IDC, which Mary co-chairs and which she mentioned earlier, is a wonderful group of faculty, staff, and administrators, as well as student reps, working diligently to ensure we are promoting the ideals of inclusion that we describe in our community. And the IDC has been working on an inclusion visioning statement, and you can see it here, and it's working through a process now, so it's something that I believe you will see multiple times. And you see in this statement much of what I've just shared with you from AAC&U, some of what you read in the article, Replacing the Cracked Mirror. Our work around inclusion speaks directly to learning as an organization, to us being a learning institution, to us challenging our own attitudes, practices, and systems. committing to an environment that respects all people, that's grounded in our Catholic social teaching and our Catholic and Benedictine heritage, to crafting a community that's geared towards the common good. So the IDC has been working diligently on this inclusion visioning statement that looks at the many ways that we can support and promote inclusion on our campuses. Some of you have heard me talk about an inclusion ecosystem on campus. My call that our history and mission of dwelling in community demands that we support and build inclusion on our campuses. And in this model, we think about inclusion in the curriculum and co-curriculum through professional development, community relations, and policies, programs, and practices. We've done a great deal of work over the past 4 years towards this end, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time. This is a publicly available document titled Action Towards a More Inclusive St. Ben's and St. John's that we shared, I believe at the end of academic year 16-17. So it's on the website. If you go to the A to Z guide, you can find it. But this document was able to pull together much of what we've been doing, both from a programmatic and a policy standpoint on our campuses. And so you'll see things ranging from how are we impacting recruitment and retention and policies to what are some of the targeted conversations we're having. We are deep in this work already. That doesn't mean that anything is perfect or done or finished. It simply means that we are exhibiting the courage to address this work and that we continue to work on it on an ongoing basis. Whether we're thinking about our common curriculum or professional development or larger policies, we continue to move forward to provide both a programming and environment that supports inclusion on our campuses. One of the great gifts of the 2016-17 academic year that we continue to see benefits from is the initial Mellon grant that we received focused on our FYS program and advising around the humanities. This program was beautifully led by Kyle Lindgaard and Jean Keller. And there were really 3 big findings, and I'll share some information about each of these bullets, and this is in the Mellon report. But it's a premier example of how we can think about inclusion and see a difference on our campus. There were dozens of faculty members involved in this program, and many of the students and their classes really benefited from the first Mellon grant. So from this study itself, we learned that several teaching-related behaviors, and I'm citing the study here, indicated growth in inclusive teaching practices over the past year. Student perception on faculty availability rose to 85% in 2017 as students reflected on how accessible their faculty members were to address issues related to inclusion and other topics. Similarly, more students and students of color in particular reported in 2017 that faculty made them feel valued in the classroom by taking a personal interest and genuinely caring about academic success. We've known all along of the dedication and commitment of our faculty to our students, and that was surely evident in the Mellon Grant research. We saw faculty say that the percentage who described themselves as well prepared to address diversity issues in the classroom rose 11 percentage points between 2016 and 17 as a result of this grant. And similarly, the percentage of faculty indicating that they were well prepared to teach or work in a racially and ethnically diverse environment rose from 14 to 21%. And though there's room for great improvement, to see a 7-point rise in 1 year is pretty amazing. Nearly 60% of the we call Mellon faculty indicated they had changed their pedagogy to encourage interaction among a more diverse student body. And the percentage of faculty who reported using teaching techniques that nurtured an inclusive environment rose 14 percentage points from 62 to 76%. So can we please give a round of applause to our faculty for their work in that initial Mellon grant? Thank you to all of the faculty in the room, Mellon and otherwise, for all of the work that you've done. Perhaps what was clearest following the Mellon grant that Jean and Kyle and, as I said, teams of faculty worked on was that it was only a beginning, that there's more work to be done, that there's more work that needed to be done to shift our culture. And it is my great good pleasure to announce that in December, the Mellon Foundation awarded us a $600,000 grant on becoming community at St. Ben's and St. John's. This grant will enable us to do the work, and it says here on the slide what we asked for. We want to become agents of change by preparing our students, faculty, and staff to dismantle oppression rather than simply learning about oppression. How do we transform oppression? And how do we make a substantive shift from the narrative of critique to the narrative of dynamic action? It was a huge team of people that worked on preparing this grant, so I thank everyone who participated in it, but most especially Mary Geller, John McGee, Brandon Woodard, Kyle Lindgard, Karen Erickson, Catherine Inc., Anna Mercedes, Jean Keller, Kathy Hansen, Ben Stummis, Amanda Janser, Catherine Stock, Diane Calabria, Barb May, Terry Check, Richard Ice, and Heather Piper Olson, all of whom gave up a large part of their summer to assist in writing this grant. Please join me in thanking them for this amazing opportunity. You'll hear a great deal about becoming community in the next few weeks, so I'm not going to go over these objectives in any detail. I just want to highlight two of them. We really want to embed the modes of transformative inclusion and to embed the modes of transformative inclusion that our process will identify in phase 1 of the grant. And our goal is to empower students, faculty, staff, and community partners to co-create structures in pursuit of a just, equitable, and sustainable future for our region. This grant will primarily be focused on St. Ben's and St. John's, but it has the capacity and the potential to work in our wider community as well, because we don't exist in a vacuum or a bubble here on campus. So becoming community allows us to think about how we become community, not just among ourselves, but in our region. Last night at a Freedom Fund dinner, I learned from the speaker that Minnesota has, according to one measure, the second to worst racial disparities in the nation as related to wealth disparity, incarceration, educational attainment, and a number of other measures. I found this to be disheartening because that means we have to not only work hard here, but how do we change our communal and regional understanding of equity and justice? I think we are called to do that. I think we have the opportunity to do that. And if everyone who's in this room just does one thing, I have no doubt that we have the capacity and the power to do that. Two final things before I open it up to your table conversations. So we've done a lot, we're doing a lot, and we will do even more on the horizon. We found out last week that a team of faculty have been provided an opportunity to participate in Diversity, Civility, and the Liberal Arts, a Council of Independent Colleges project, a highly competitive project. I know that nearly 100 schools applied to participate and only 25 schools were selected, and St. Ben's and St. John's team was one of those 25 schools selected. So our faculty and staff will go off from June 3rd through the 6th to study and to participate in this institute, which is being led by Beverly Daniel Tatum, who was on our campus perhaps 18 months ago through the McCarthy Center. I'm also pleased to announce that in July of this year, we will bring back Liberal Arts Illuminated. We had a hugely successful conference in 2016 focused on leadership in the liberal arts. It was so successful that we were asked to do it again. This time, Liberal Arts Illuminated will focus on reframing the narrative, leadership toward inclusive excellence, and we will address the questions that you see on the slide there. It was a wonderful opportunity that we had in 2016, and I'm delighted that we're able to bring it back again this year. So that's the update that I wanted to provide. And before we turn it over to President Hemesath, we'd actually like to ask you to do a little bit of work at your table. And we will, if you will write your answer and leave it on the table, we will collect it at the end. But I actually want to go back to the opening question. What does it look like? What does it mean to be an inclusive community? What does it mean to be an inclusive community? If you could brainstorm that question for about 7 minutes and let us know. But wait, it's simply not, you see, I stopped you there. It's simply not enough to say what it means. We want to know, what is your role in that community? Because it can't just be about leaders, faculty, students, or staff. It's about all of us together. So what is your role? So in your 7 to 10 minutes, what does it look like or mean to be an inclusive community, and what is your role in that community? I will keep time, and I'll come back shortly to see what we learn. Thank you. Okay. Just as a subtle reminder, as President Hemesath comes up to join us, a subtle reminder, you were to write down, table right in front of me, what it means, as well as what your role is. So I'll be looking for that information. Yeah, now I see people taking paper out. Okay. Welcome back, one and all. I'm going to turn it over to President Hemesath. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome back. We are delighted to have you all back on campus. Both of our campuses are very lovely when students are gone and it's peaceful and quiet, but it doesn't take too long before we start to miss you. It's a little too quiet, so we're really glad you're back. Thank you all for taking a part of your afternoon to come and join us this afternoon. The turnout is incredible. We have people standing in the back even. That's an unusual event. That's great. So I want to talk a little bit about the article, at least start with the article that was assigned, though I will note just before I get started that I will not give you a homework assignment. I'm the easy professor today, so you can take notes, but you're not going to have to turn them in. So as I read through the article today, for today, I was a little surprised that I didn't quite recognize the higher education world that we live in here at St. Ben's and St. John's. I mean, there are issues to address with regard to inclusivity, of course, and I'll touch on those, but the description at the beginning of the article that talked about higher education as being a very instrumental activity, all about getting a job, all about making money. It just, I won't read the whole quote to you, but the notion here that this is all about a successful career in the information economy. It's not about personal growth or discovery of meaning, let alone any kind of larger social purpose. That does not describe the higher education world that I know best. I think it's probably an unfair characterization of higher ed more broadly, but it does not describe St. Ben's and St. John's, I don't think. And so I wanted to just note that, I think we absolutely do care about a wide range of things in our mission when we are addressing the educational needs of our students and our faculty and staff who are working so hard to make that a successful experience for you all. I won't apologize. We won't apologize. I don't think Mary won't apologize either for caring about the kinds of jobs and the opportunities you'll have once you graduate. I mean, there's no question that that's part of our mission here, is to make sure that you get a great experience and you can go out into the world and do great things in whatever area or discipline you want to. And so the notion that colleges somehow are wrong for caring about the economic prospects of our students, that's just crazy. I mean, of course, we should care about those things, but that's not all we care about, of course. At St. Ben's and St. John's, we really believe that you're engaging in a holistic educational experience here. You came here presumably because you wanted that experience. Learning inside the classroom, of course, is first and foremost, and I'll come back and touch on that a little bit later, but also what happens outside the classroom. This sort of experience that you're having now, the experience you have with all of the extracurricular activities of 100+ organizations we have on our 2 campuses, is an important part of your educational experience as well. And then finally, I think it's really important to note that the inclusivity that we care so much about at these 2 institutions is also a tremendously important part of your educational experience. And you are getting a significantly better education at these institutions now than I got and some of my peers who are scattered around the room here when we were at St. Ben's and St. John's 10, 20, 30, 35, close to 40 years ago. And I want to explain why I think that is, and then note some of the challenges that this increasingly diverse community offers. But I want to start by noting that it's a huge asset for all of us at these institutions to be in the kind of environment where we are a much more diverse and inclusive place than we ever were 40 years ago when I started at St. John's. And I want to note that the diversity that we face that is a whole range of characteristics that represent diversity. And on the second page of the article, the author notes, we're talking about diversities that are racial diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, class diversity, religion diversity, sexuality diversity, ability diversity. Interestingly, she missed one that's really important in this day and age: political diversity, intellectual diversity. That's also part of what we have at St. Ben's and St. John's that is tremendously important. So when I was a student here, as I've said in other contexts, I came from the state of Iowa, and I represented diversity at the time. And that's because we were so Minnesotan and we were so Caucasian. That diversity wasn't even on the radar. Having a tiny bit of geographic diversity was what counted. I had a friend that was Lutheran, and that was kind of shocking at that time because we were 90% Catholic when I started at St. John's back in the 70s. So the things that have changed tremendously in the time that in the past 40 years and that you are living examples of, though this change has been taking place slowly over that period of time, but I would say in the last decade there's been a tremendous shift in the mix of our student body, and I think it's important to note that. So first of all, there's gender diversity. When I was at St. John's was significantly bigger than the College of St. Benedict. And as you know now, women outnumber men on our campuses combined. It's about 53% women, 47% men. And that's actually closer to 50-50 than it is in the national average is something closer to 60-40 if you look across the country. But still, that's been a big change in the last 40+ years. Secondly, as I noted, religious diversity has changed. So we are still majority Catholic, but the entering class this year was 55% Catholic and 45% something else. And that something else, of course, being in Minnesota, of that 45%, there are a lot more Lutherans now than there were when I was a student, and that's probably the majority of that 45%. But there are students that come from all different kinds of religious traditions, and lots of students that come from no religious tradition, and that's important to note as a significant change in what's taken place in the last 40+ years. The biggest change you can see looking around the room. The racial and ethnic diversity on these campuses has changed dramatically in the past 40 years. And in fact, it's even changed dramatically in the last 10 years. I was looking at some data recently, and 10 years ago, the entering class at St. John's was 7% American students of color. This fall, the entering class at St. John's was 19% American students of color. St. Ben's, the numbers are similar. I don't remember what they were 10 years ago. I think the entering class for St. Ben's this fall was 17% American students of color. And if you add international students, 5% of our population, between 20 and 25% of our undergraduate population are represented by American students of color or international students. A huge change in what's taken place literally in the last decade in our community. And so I think it's important to note that that's a significant change. The other thing I would note, I'm not sure about the ratio or the percentage of gay students in our student population when I started or even 10 years ago. I don't think we collected that data, and I certainly know when I was a student there was no PRISM to offer support for gay students, though obviously they were on our campus. A close friend of mine who never came out when he was at St. John's lived quietly during his 4 years here as a gay student and didn't have the kind of support to feel he could come out publicly. Now I hope that that's absolutely not the case among our students, but that's a significant change. Maybe not in the number of students, but in the way those students are able to live out their lives on our campuses. So another important change. And all of these things are really just reflections of the broader society, right? It's not as if St. John's and St. Ben's has been changing dramatically on its own without being affected by what happens outside of our campuses. And of course, that change in racial and ethnic diversity is a reflection of what's changed in our country and in the state of Minnesota as well. The ability for gay students to live their lives openly on our campuses is a function of what's happening externally in the society more broadly. So we are reflecting what's going on in that society, and that's a good thing to do. But I think there are also ways in which our educational experience here can try to help us do better than the external society is doing in some very, very important ways. So, and then finally, I would just note the other important area in which we are diverse. It's very hard to see. You can't look around and see this kind of diversity, but the kind of intellectual and political diversity that's, I think, a central part of an academic experience at any institution, but I think especially at St. John's and St. Ben's, is very important to note. Lots of schools are a little more homogeneous politically than I think we are. I think we actually represent a pretty broad spectrum of intellectual and political diversity on our campuses, and I think that's tremendously important. It's an opportunity that not all schools provide. You have a good chance that if you walk down the hall in your dormitory, you walk across to the apartment across from where you're living, you're likely to find someone who has pretty different political or social justice or social policy views than you may have. And that's a tremendously important opportunity for you to be able to take advantage of in our two communities here. So I think that is an additional aspect of diversity, but broadly speaking, the whole package is that you get a chance to come to St. Ben's and St. John's and get a chance to experience the world in which you're going to go out and live and be successful in professionally. You're going to go into communities that look very much like this community, and you're going to get a chance to work in professional environments that looks very much like this group of students that you're living and working with right now. And it's absolutely essential that you take advantage of those opportunities and make sure that you interact as much as you possibly can with the whole range of diversity as it exists on our two campuses. That isn't to say, of course, you shouldn't have your own group of friends, but make sure that you stretch yourself when you're here. And one of the things that I think is really important for us to do is make sure that we get a little bit uncomfortable when we're on our campuses and when we're going through our educational experience over the 4 years that we're here. If you live in a comfortable little bubble where you're hanging out with the same kind of kids you hung out with in high school, and they're the same kids that could be living in your neighborhood at home, even though they might come from other towns or cities, you're not taking full advantage of what you should be doing at these institutions. You absolutely need to stretch yourself and make yourself a little bit uncomfortable. If you are not uncomfortable in your learning at these intellectually engaging institutions, you're not taking full advantage of all we have to offer. Some of that's in the classroom. Take classes, study things that are different from what you might have studied before. Learn why someone is passionate about economics. How could they possibly fall in love with that subject? But I've got some time if you want to talk about that. But stretch yourself intellectually, but even more importantly, and particularly in the context of this conversation about inclusivity, stretch yourself personally. Get to know someone in your dormitory that came from a very different background than you have. Get to know someone who grew up in a different part of the country. Get to know someone who grew up in a different part of the world, and talk to them about their experience. And I think one of the important things you'll discover is that you actually have a lot in common. I think it's really important in these conversations about diversity to not lose sight of the fact that we are all human beings that have the same sort of wants and needs and desires. And even if we view the world differently, politically or socially, even if we've had tremendously different experiences growing up, we still have a tremendous number of things in common. We all have hopes and dreams for what we want to do for ourselves. We all have families we came from. We have parents. We likely have siblings. We're loved by those individuals. We have individuals we love. We have hopes and dreams for our own loves in the future. All of those things are tremendously important to remember. We can not to downplay the differences that we have. They're absolutely out there and they're real and we should learn from them. But we shouldn't overemphasize those differences as we try to recognize the commonalities that we have as human beings. And I think that's a tremendously important value that we at St. Ben's and St. John's emphasize through our Benedictine values, respect for individuals, and the importance of living in community that we do every single day. But I want to come back to the diversity and inclusivity issue for just a moment to emphasize that as we live in this increasingly diverse student body and faculty and staff body as well, for sure, though the changes have been faster in the student body, it's important to recognize that when we come together to live in community and to learn from each other and to recognize there's going to be some rubbing together, some discomfort that sometimes takes place when you meet people that have different backgrounds or different views than you do. But it's absolutely important that we have the ability and the right to share those views with each other publicly. But I think it's really important to note that as we engage in the kind of intellectual openness, intellectual exchange with each other, that we do it in a Benedictine fashion, that we recognize that we have a responsibility in this community for how we choose to interact with each other. We're not going to ever be able to make someone completely comfortable if they have different views than we do or came from a different background maybe, but we have an important responsibility as a member of this community to respect the people that we're interacting with, the people that we're talking to, and to think carefully about if I express this particular view about politics or this view about social policy, how will my audience hear that? I can't simply just spout off anything I want and not have the responsibility that goes with that to think about how that thought, that idea, that comment is going to be heard. That's true in the classroom, and I assume it's a little bit easier to do that in the classroom where you've got some additional guidance from faculty members about that. But it's especially important in your interactions personally outside of a more structured environment like the classroom, that you think very carefully about what it is that you believe and why you're saying what you're saying and how you think your listener is going to hear that. What is it about their experience, their background, their own views that will allow them to hear what you are trying to express? How can they hear that best? How can you express that in a way that helps them hear it in a way that is valuable for their learning as well as for true communication between two individuals? So I think that our Benedictine ethos that is so important in this community is tremendously important as we find ways to engage the diversity that exists in these communities across all of the ways in which we would choose to interact in the classroom, outside the classroom, and beyond. And I want to close by just noting that this is such an important skill to nurture, not only for your own learning and for the benefit of those that you'll be interacting with, this ability to listen carefully and think hard about how you might express ideas and views, but I think it's really important in our country right now. I think it's not a particularly shocking statement to say that if you look around the world, or you look around our political and social world these days, we're not talking to each other very well. Our ability to communicate across different across different politics, different ideas, different classes is not great. If you look at what happens on the internet, that probably exacerbates these things. But it's very important that you're going to go into the world, and regardless of what your views are on any subject matter, you're going to have about half the world that doesn't share that same view. And you're going to have to live and interact with those individuals. And the question is, how can you go about doing that? How can you have a real meaningful conversation and interaction with those with whom you differ? And we had the presidents of the Minnesota private colleges get together, and we read a book called The Big Sort, in which the author, Bill Bishop, looks at data and discovers that Americans are clustering in what he phrases as like-minded neighborhoods, like-minded communities, where your ability to interact with the odds of you interacting with someone who has a different perspective on the world than you do are diminished because you're tending to hang out with people who share the exact same views that you do. And he argues that in fact, the subtitle of his book is Why the Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart. Well, I think you can see some of that in our politics these days, where civility seems to have disappeared in most of our conversations about political and social issues in a way that I think is really problematic. And this is where I think that you all, this is what gives me hope when I worry about that, is I think about the Johnnies and Bennies that we're sending into the world. And you're not all angels. In fact, very few of you are angels. But I hope that if we do our job well with this incredibly diverse and interesting community that you all are living in for 4 years, that you take some skills into the world to help us have conversations across difference, conversations that have real meaning, in which two individuals can really learn and interact in a human fashion with each other in a way that I think we're not great at right now. But you represent hope for me and for Mary and for the faculty and staff that spend their time and energy helping educate you. So that I'll stop and we'll take some questions, I guess. Okay, thank you.
All right, questions?
Or comments, observations.
Muka over.
You asked us what does inclusion look like for us. What does inclusion look like for you? President Hinton, President Hemesath?
So Muka asked, what does inclusion look like for us? And I would say much of what I presented, us being a learning organization, moving beyond the point of simply teaching and learning about oppression, but actually dismantling oppression, recognizing difficult structures and dismantling them, to me would be sort of the high level of where I'd like to see all of us get to in our nation, but particularly on our campuses. But even more, I think it's when, if you were to ask any Benny or Johnny on our campus, did they feel like they had an ownership stake, that they owned, that not only had they been transformed by our institution, but had our institution transformed them? When we get to a point where every student, where there are no patterns and who says no, but most students say yes, then to me, that's what an inclusive community would look like. That any one person in here would say, yeah, I own St. Ben's, I own St. John's, and St. John's is a better place because I'm here. St. Ben's is a better place because I'm here. And it's not just I've been transformed by them, but I have transformed the institution.
You know, all of you come in here with hopes and dreams for what your 4 years of an undergraduate education are going to do for you personally in all kinds of dimensions. And so for me, an inclusive community is one in which at the end of those 4 years, every single student that comes in here is able to say that I was able to fulfill my educational, personal, social hopes and dreams during my time at this educational institution. It did for me what I wanted it to do to help me grow intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, whatever it is that you hoped for, so that no one in the community doesn't have the opportunity to fully realize the dreams that they had when they came into this place, these places.
I'm sorry, but my follow-up question is like, when do you think that will be a possibility? For both of those things.
For both of those, I think that we've been working on it for a long time. I don't have a date. As I said at the start of my comments, Muka, students have been wrestling with these issues, at least in my 30-year experience on having been a student. So I don't have a date for you. I think we're intensifying our wrestling with these issues. I think it ebbs and flows. There are moments when we get much better. There are moments of pain. And that's going to happen. But I started out by saying that this is going to be difficult work. I should have added it's long-term work. Culture change isn't something that happens overnight because it involves all the people and the will of the people in the communities. So it will take some time. But I think we've been accelerated. I think the prior Mellon grant, the commitment of the people in the room, the current Mellon grant, the CIC project, the consortium on faculty diversity, which we've just joined, all of those things can accelerate us. But I would be misleading you if I said check back in March. We can check in March and see what we've done. And we've done some things. You may have seen the document that I referenced that came out. We've done a lot. There's a long way yet to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's a process. It's not clear if we're ever going to be there. I mean, every 4 years, the whole population turns over. We have a whole new group of students that come in from a whole different set of experiences, and so we need to work to make it a great experience for them and to be as inclusive as we possibly can. But it has absolutely been, there have been some significant changes in the last decade or two at these institutions, but I realize for you all, 2 decades is your whole life. It's like, why can't it happen faster than that? Well, I just think these things don't take place tremendously fast, but the question is, are we making progress? Are we doing better today than we did yesterday? Are we doing better this year than we were last year? And I think the answer to that question is yes.
There's someone, I'm just going to take the microphone in because anyone over here, someone over here has a question.
Thank you both for presenting. I think often as students, we notice and perceive certain inequalities on campus that go unperceived by the administration or faculty or the monastic community. How would you encourage us to bring these to light?
Well, I mean, I hope everyone in this room feels like they have access to Mary and Michael as administrators and lots of other professionals around the room. So I hope there are ways in which you can share those issues with us. I would say, I think we need to know specifically about what examples you might be talking about. I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I would say that, I think we are pretty aware of certain inequalities on our campuses, particularly around economic issues. And I think we know that as you look around, and that's a diversity characteristic I didn't even focus on, but you look around this room, there's obviously tremendous economic diversity among our student body as well. And I think that we are aware of that, and we try to build, at least in our financial aid packages, we try to be attentive to those issues. One of the things we've talked about is how to make sure that the educational experiences on our 2 campuses are not affected too much by economic inequalities in economic family resources. So in terms of who goes abroad, in terms of who gets a chance to do various extracurricular activities, we do what we can to try to address those. But we know that that's an ongoing challenge, but we have reached out to donors on occasion to try to see if they would provide some support for some of those inequalities. So I don't know if that's exactly the issue that you're speaking about, but we certainly recognize that economic resources do have some influence on the kind of experience you have. We're trying to minimize those to the extent that we can do that.
I would say what I would ask is that when issues come up, that we have dialogue about them. So it is so heartening to see so many people in this room today, but it's nice to have a friend to get your back there. Come to events throughout the year and share with us what's going on. When we have inclusion visioning days, come to those events. When issues come up, if you think and it's germane and relevant in the classroom, share there. Student development, particularly IISS, they do a host of programming. Come and share the voice. And I think one of the issues that Michael touched on is how do we engage in civil dialogue? So before it's at a flashpoint, I know sometimes we're so compelled, I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to say anything. And then it reaches a point where when it emerges, it's difficult and it's painful. How do we have dialogue before that? Part of the Mellon Grant is having these learning communities set up to address that very issue that you talked about. But I would just ask that you engage, and I see MC sitting there. So also talk to your student senate senates about these issues as well. You have representatives in many different areas, including but not limited to the Cultural Affairs Board that you can have these conversations with. So take advantage of the variety of outlets. And maybe what I'm hearing you say is maybe we need to have some sort of way that we direct, and I'm looking for Mary Geller, a way that we can direct people to when you have a concern or you want to share feedback that's clear for students. But there are lots of venues. I would just say, don't wait until it's at a boiling point to talk to someone. And I would say that about any issue, any issue. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you for both of you giving this nice talk, but I just have one comment to make. So last year, after the event on the bus happened, a couple of students came to the 2020 forum, and as I can remember, the forum was for both of you to discuss the 2020 plan CSB SJU has for their students and faculty. So as I can remember clearly, Hemesath responded to our speech that day, talking about whatever happened on the bus, saying that it was their constitutional right, or whatever they said was constitutionally okay because it was freedom of speech. Now, my thing is, I understand that we all have a responsibility for inclusivity, but as a student of color, it's very difficult for me to open myself up when my leader is not setting the correct foundation. So for me to talk to students who think whatever was said on that bus was okay. And I'm struggling to talk about this today because it's very emotional. It's emotional because a lot of us students of color, the truth of the matter is inclusivity and the conversation about it is beautiful. But the reality, I'm one of the many students that we don't feel like a Benny. We don't feel like a Johnny. And the reason why is because our leader, who we all look up to, constitutionally supported what happened on the bus. Maybe not personally, but that's what was said. And that's why, I don't regret coming to St. Ben's. I'm a Peace Studies major, and I'm forever going to be a Peace Studies major, and I'm happy to be a Benny. But if I can sit here and say that it's easy for me to believe all the things about inclusivity that was presented today, or how there's future plans in the works for it, I'm very sorry, but it's not very clear to me. Because I just think that there has to be a balance. If students bring up an event that happened and you say things like that, but then discuss inclusivity, it's very difficult for students to interpret that correctly. And I just think that if we don't have that foundation there, then the talks of inclusivity is bound to nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. It's important to be able to say these things in a public setting. I appreciate that. I know it's not easy to talk about. I don't have much to add to what I said earlier, that I think that there will be uncomfortable moments in your education at these institutions, and if there aren't, you're not getting the full education that you should be getting here. But I also think that when people make comments, political, social, whatever they might be, they have a responsibility to think about the context in which those comments are being said, and to think about what position their listeners are in as they're hearing these comments. And I'm sorry there was a misinterpretation. I absolutely did not support the context in which those comments were made a year ago. Mary and I sent a letter out to the community after that incident to make it clear that we thought that wasn't an appropriate place to exercise whatever speech rights which you all have. And I'm sorry that the event occurred the way that it did, but I also think that it's important to recognize that we're going to have ideas and thoughts that are raised that are painful and challenging. To do it on a link bus is not the appropriate place to do that, absolutely. But to get into a situation in a classroom or outside the classroom where you're talking to someone who has different views than you do, that's an important part of your educational experience here. I truly believe that.
I would just add that when you asked what is the vision, like when will it, what would it look like if we were an inclusive community, you really tapped on what my aspiration is. You said you're happy to be a Benny, but it's difficult to trust our intentions around inclusion. It's when people can say, I'm happy to be a Benny, and I trust those intentions, and I see myself, and I belong here, would be my vision for that. Other questions? I see, okay. We're going to just go in a straight line. We're going to start with Owen in the back and then come up to Mulkey. And I'm sorry, what's your name? Joseph? Okay. So Owen, Mulkey, and Joseph.
Hi, thank you for taking questions and for mentioning the school's efforts to give students who suffer from income inequality a chance with extracurricular activities. But I was wondering what the institution plans on doing to address essential things such as registering for housing and for classes, where students who suffer from income inequality are usually put at the bottom of the food chain again and aren't able to get their best picks with classes and housing. Is there a resolution for that you can see happening?
I know that our business office at St. Ben's, and who works very closely with the business office at St. John's, so I think they're having these conversations and dialogue. We've been talking about how do we think about our policies in a way that best support all students so that there's not a systematic discrepancy in the ways that students are able to register for classes, who gets first pick, who gets last pick. So we started, where's Sue? There's Sue. So we started that conversation through an inclusion some work last year, and we're continuing to work on that. So if you look at SD 2020, which she mentioned a little while ago, under the fourth pillar and the second pillar, transformational and holistic development and shared future, sustainable future, we're looking at those policies to try to make some of those changes to address the very issue that you talk about. I don't know if that made it onto a slide or not, but that is a policy issue we're working on.
Yeah, of course, we're doing the same things at St. John's. Our business offices work very closely together. I would simply say, if any of you have financial issues that make it hard for you to pay your term bill, come and talk to the people in the financial aid office, and we will try to work out something to help make that burden lighter and try to make sure that you don't have a financial hold put on your registration and housing issues. So as soon as you think there's an issue, come and talk to us. I can't promise it's going to make everybody completely happy, but come and talk to us, and we'll see if we can help work out those issues. We know that those are tremendous challenges for many of our students.
Mulkey was next up. I have a few questions regarding inclusive measure protocol. On the note that Batu mentioned,
when discussing, as you both discussed a lot, acceptance of other people's opinions and political views, when taking these inclusive measures, do we recognize the dangers of treating all opinions as equal? For example, what happened on the bus, them expressing their political opinion was seen as inappropriate in the context, but their views were still considered okay. I think that's dangerous, considering that for some people, those views are life-threatening, of chanting "build a wall," while we might view it, or you might view it, as someone saying, "I don't like Mondays," or "I don't like coffee." And I think that as we continue to discuss inclusive measures, are we recognizing that all opinions aren't on the same spectrum or level or equal value given to them? Does that make sense?
Sure, and I think that the challenge for us as a community is to address all ideas in the intellectual way that we approach topics, any topic that we might consider. If you disagree with someone, you need to make an argument for why you disagree with them. What is it about your view that's different than their view? How do you express that? How do you share that? You use evidence, you use critical thinking. That's part of what an academic community is all about. So I think that It certainly is true that there are ideas at which we do not find acceptable in this community, but the way to address those is not to try to shut those ideas out, but to address them in an intellectual and academic fashion like we would with any idea.
I think that's what higher ed institutions are really being called to do. How do we think about having constructive and productive dialogue with conflicting ideas? How do we teach this slide is down, the critical thinking skills that we need to address and value and weigh ideas? And that's what we are called to do. I like your use of the phrase inclusion protocol. I had not heard that before.
Kind of on the similar note, we discussed that there is a racial disparity between the higher income people that attend and lower income students. When it comes to making inclusive measures, do you consider the idea of the donors' wishes and plans, and have you considered what's going to occur if your donors' wishes go against the inclusive measures that you guys think are proper to be taken?
We didn't in this session, although there will be a conversation about budget coming up, and I hope some of you will choose to join us for that conversation as well. So when you think about race and economics, there are some alignments at our institutions, but we always want to be careful to not say that those two things are always connected. We want to be careful with that. In terms of donors and inclusion, right now, at least in our donor base, inclusion is top of mind for everyone that we are supporting. I've not had an experience where someone has said inclusion is bad or I don't want to support that. Donors don't drive the mission. The way you fundraise is you compel people by the mission. You compel people with the mission. And I certainly wouldn't, that has not ever been an issue, and I would handle it were that to come up, but that's never come up in our donor base.
Likewise, I mean, our donor base is largely Johnnies and Bennies who've had a similar sort of experience that you all have had. And in my experience going out and talking to donors, they're tremendously excited about the changes that are taking place at these institutions. When we describe the way in which the institutions have become more diverse, there's tremendous excitement thinking, you got all these diverse students to come to the woods of central Minnesota and to St. Joe. Boy, good job. So I don't think that you need to worry about that piece. And in fact, I have one little bit of empirical evidence. St. John's just finished a capital campaign this last June, and the area in which we had the most success relative to our initial goal was in raising funding for scholarships. Our donors stepped forward and said that's a priority that we care deeply about, and we want to support that. So I don't think that will be a concern among our donor base.
My last question was just out of curiosity, is the inclusive measures being taken or have been taken proactive or reactive? Is it concerning issues that have occurred and trying to prevent them, or is it thinking ahead? And if it is reactive, how are we moving towards making them proactive choices rather than waiting until something occurs?
The work that we've done, it's a mix, Mulkey. I mean, honestly, if something erupts on campus, you have to react to what has happened on campus. The inclusion ecosystem, the original Mellon grant, the new Mellon grant, the diversity, civility, and the liberal arts, the consortium on faculty diversity, I would label all of that as proactive. You can't reactively shift a culture. You really have to be proactive in your efforts around that. But there are moments when one has to react. And Joseph.
I give a shout out to Fatu and Moki. I empathize with their point of views, and specifically coming here. I'm a first generation Mexican American. My brother comes here too, so that's nice. But definitely coming here was not the statement that you guys had. Coming here, I experienced behemoth discrimination and from students as well as faculty, and that does take a toll, especially when the mission contradicts what occurs on what happens to some students on a daily basis. And this brings me to the question that I want to ask: how do you get people to care? I've taken gender studies classes. I've had conversations with students, and it's all nice to say all these things, but there are students who don't care, who just simply can live, they can go there, they can live their life knowing that there is racial and racial economic discrimination that occurs here and also in the greater world. I just want to know what
That's possibly the hardest question, right? I mean, you look around, an incredibly full room, people that are here because they care about these issues. It's not to suggest anyone that's not here doesn't, but you raise an important point. There are certainly members of the community for whom this is not a priority issue. And I think our responsibility as leaders, our responsibility as an institution is to try to help those students who come here without having that view, that this is an important issue to address, to learn through interacting with their peers and their classmates, and I hope at some point their friends, that these are important issues to a tremendous number of people. Are we going to make everybody care before they leave? Or are we going to have some way to test that before they go? Absolutely not. But the hope is that the educational experience we have in this environment, with these increasingly diverse communities, will make students understand how powerfully important these issues are to many in this community and why they should care about those issues as well.
You know, I've been wrestling with that question for a minute, Joseph, a minute being, you know, the entirety of my life. And so there's a part of me that some people aren't going to care. And you will exhaust yourself, and you'll become bitter, and you will become more like those people than you want to be if you wait for them. You have to decide within yourself what you care about and how you're going to promote and facilitate those things for a more just world. Some people aren't going to care. Some people don't understand the hurt that you feel, and that's because of the narrowness of their experience. That's not a statement about you. People in this room know that I attribute the fact that I'm here today to when my guidance counselor told me that Black women don't go to college. And nothing has motivated me more in my life probably than that statement. And so I feel your pain. I am sorry for your pain. But you have to figure out what's important to you. And every person in this room can open a pathway for someone else. People laugh sometimes because, as the Bennies will tell you, I tell them all the time how much I love them and how much I care about them. And I do that because sometimes you just need to know that one other person in this community, in the world, not just St. Ben's and St. John's, has your back and sees you and knows that you're good enough just as you are. And that's not a very common message that we get these days. So at every opportunity, I would say to people in this room, you look to your friend and you tell them that you love them and you care about them and that you know they can do it. And that makes it so much easier to put the other noise out of your head, because you can let those people who don't care destroy you. Don't let that happen. You get strength and energy from those people who don't care. All right? Thank you, Lisa. We'll take one more question. Another question. I see a lot of people who haven't asked. Oh, there we go. Hi, Karn.
Hi, I'm Karn Johnston in the theater department. I've been teaching a long time, so I have very strong feelings about these things. I think if there's something that comes up in the classroom, which has actually happened, where very racist comments have been said, it's my responsibility as a faculty member to help the students be able to talk about that in a civilized manner and help them find ways to be able to listen to each other. And I think in the dorms, the student development folks have just done stunning work. But there are places on our campuses, like the bus, where there isn't someone who's like trained to help out with these situations that are extremely unpleasant and scary to some people. And I wish that we had maybe more conversations about what really constitutes hate speech as opposed to this is my opinion, because there is a difference. And if we're not willing to say that there are certain things that we do not support other people to say, like I don't think you should, be able to go to school or vote or whatever the thing is. There are some things that are reasonable to have conversations about, and there are others that scare people. And I think we really need to have some kind of conversation about the difference between hate speech and things that just need to be talked out. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I would point you, one effort we had in that direction was last fall when we had a wonderful series of conversations and lectures in response to the incidents in Charlottesville. And there was one, I think it was called, and forgive me if I'm wrong, Hate Speech versus Free Speech. That video is available, but that's an ongoing, Michael used the word ongoing earlier, that's an ongoing conversation, not unrelated to what Mulkey was saying about the protocols and how do we set these boundaries. I think we have time for one more, and I see James Camo in the back. Who brought an entourage.
Thank you, President Mary, President Michael. My name is James Camo. I'm a joining class of 09. I just wanted to make a really brief comment. I think one thing stood true in my head as the presidents were talking, and that is, as students, you got 4 years here and you leave. It's crazy to think it's almost 10 years since I graduated. I work with alums every day, and one thing we forget in this room is there's more to St. John's and St. Ben's than there is in our campuses. Actually, majority of it is out there. As students, two things for you. One, reach out to those people at all times. And second thing is, you are going to be an alum in a year, in 5 months, in 4 years. Don't go away and not come back to make the change that you would like to see in St. Ben's and St. John's. Alums transform these institutions every day. We meet thousands and thousands of them with my IA team. I'd like to see more of you coming back, talking to students, talking to presidents, talking to staff, talking to your professors, and providing opportunities for how we can reach there. As Mary said, when I was here as a student, there was 6 from Africa, but I could possibly name all of them. 2 years ago, when I was invited to the African Night, I walked in the room and I couldn't believe my eyes that these were all students on our campus. So you might not see where we're going, but I think sometimes it feels good, even within all those pains that majority of us, we have experienced, to count your blessings one by one and have a higher hope for tomorrow. Thank you.
All right, we are out of time officially. Thank you all for being here today. But this doesn't end the conversation. You have to come to other events as well. Tomorrow night, Father Brian Massengale will be on campus. In March, it's Women's History Month. There are all sorts of events. We need you at all of them if inclusion's going to work. Go to meetings of student clubs and groups. It doesn't have to be about inclusion. It's about being present and in relation with one another. Thank you.